I'm told that we need to speak into the microphone if we want to be heard, so
All right.
I want to keep that in mind.
Thank
Great to
you.
see you all.
Yep. Thank you so much, Senator Carper, and thank you to everyone who has joined us here today to discuss the important issues facing our communities. To the advocates in the room who have committed to working with us on addressing these challenges, thank you all as well. You see all the folks behind me. When we turn on the tap, we expect to get clean, safe, life-giving water. We don't often think about the complex infrastructure systems that reliably deliver the clean, safe water to our families every day until something goes wrong. In many areas of the country, this infrastructure is crumbling to the point of impacting public health. In some areas, families must choose between paying the power bill or the water bill. And I was in one of those communities just this past Monday in a town in southern Illinois called Cairo, Illinois. It is simply unacceptable for a child to suffer brain damage, renal failure, or harm to their immune systems from drinking contaminated water, especially not in the 21st century. EPA has issued public health standards for roughly 90 contaminants. Many of us are unfamiliar with these contaminants. Some are household names like lead, arsenic, and mercury. The vast majority of these contaminants are regulated and controlled at treatment facilities. In this context, maintaining our water infrastructure facilities is absolutely essential to combating our water quality challenges. Our nation's drinking water system, mostly built in the early to mid-20th century, consists of approximately 1 million miles of pipe. Their average lifespan is 75 to 100 years old. Consequently, legacy and emerging contaminants continue to require close attention. Perhaps the most widely recognized drinking water contaminant is lead, whose primary exposure pathway is lead service in limes. For vulnerable populations like young children, pregnant mothers, and the elderly, exposure to lead can be life-altering. Yet mounting evidence suggests that lead contamination in water is grossly underestimated and inadequately addressed. According to the American Water Works Association, replacing failing and outdated systems and expanding capacity to match population growth will cost at least $1 trillion over the next 25 years. Complicating these challenges, well, is simply not sexy. Not a sexy topic to be championing. But you don't see a lot of ribbon-cutting ceremonies at water treatment facilities, but it is the backbone of public health and safety in our communities. The need is massive, and communities face daunting investment challenges to guarantee what most of us take for granted. It seems obvious, but race and socioeconomic class should never play a role in the quality of water, but so often it does. Unequal resources lead to unequal investment, which drives unequal access to safe drinking water. If we truly are the greatest nation on the planet, we cannot allow our communities to suffer from contaminated drinking water, and it is critical that our infrastructure investments assist communities that cannot afford to upgrade their water infrastructure by themselves. Put simply, access to clean, safe, affordable drinking water should be available to everyone, every day, regardless of where they may live. We're 7 months into the Trump administration, and we still haven't seen any meaningful details of the president's infrastructure plan. Interestingly, the president's budget maintains funding for the state revolving funds, but slashes the EPA's budget by 31% and could consolidate regional EPA offices. The president's plan also eliminates other critical water infrastructure programs like the U.S. Department of Agriculture's rural development programs. The crisis in Flint that is still ongoing left a deep and enduring impression on me. I served in the House of Representatives on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. And I remember in so many of those hearings, but one of the very first hearings on the Flint water crisis, looking out and seeing the committee room filled with people who had gotten on buses and ridden all night to come to tell their stories. And at the time, I had just given birth to my baby girl, and I had been pregnant at the same time as this was ongoing in Flint. And in the back of the room, a woman, I couldn't see her, all I could see was her hand holding up a little pink baby bottle, and the water in it was brown. And it was the exact same kind of pink baby bottle I used for my daughter. And I remember looking at that and thinking, oh my God, I could have been, what if I would forced to drink water like that my entire pregnancy for this one child that I struggled for 10 years to have, and that this is the only water I have with which to make her formula and to feed her. It has never left my consciousness what that was like and how serious this is. And so to this day, I just can't understand how institutions at every level of government was almost synchronized in their failure to do their job and protect public health. And I worry that slashing EPA's personnel and undermining critical water programs and the independence of scientists who do the water testing may lead to another Flint scenario. We can no longer turn a blind eye to our growing water infrastructure challenges. We must face these challenges head on. So I really appreciate everyone's willingness to participate in this most important discussion. I thank you all for being here. And I would like to ask my ranking member if you'd like to say a few words.
I would like to say a few words. And the first words I'd like to say are, the first word I want to say is welcome. Thank you for taking the time out of your day. Some of you have come quite a ways, and we're grateful for your presence and for the life's work that you do. A lot of discussion and debate, a lot of attention around the country on the issue of healthcare. And it's one of the primary focuses for me over the years on healthcare has been not just spending money on people when they get sick, but spending money to make sure that people don't get sick and to make sure that we have a focus on wellness and prevention. And that's, that debate is actually part of what we're talking about here today, which is important. Our senators and Tammy and I were back home in our states a week ago for 4th of July recess, and parades all over the state, met with all kinds of people around the state. I have a much smaller state than she has. But I was reminded many times during the 4th of July that week of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you know, it's pretty hard to have life, frankly, liberty, and much happiness if we don't have safe water to drink. It's one of the critical requirements for those three things in our life that we value very highly. So I'm grateful we've come together. It's a timely subject, not just because of health and our interest in what does the Constitution says. The Constitution actually has in the preamble, talks about the general welfare, promote the general welfare, which as far as I'm concerned, that would probably include having water that's safe to drink. And a lot of discussion about infrastructure, and the Senator has mentioned that, but again, as she says, we've not seen a lot of detail on what the new administration would like to do with respect to either roads, highways, bridges, ports, rivers. We haven't seen much with respect to what they'd like to do with respect to clean drinking water and wastewater treatment. Hopefully we will soon. But those are all important issues for our country. And there's a lot of things that the president talked about when he ran for office, as did Secretary Clinton. So these issues are timely for not just because of health, which is a big issue right now, not just because of infrastructure, which has been, it looks like an area we ought to be able to find some agreement on. But hopefully you can help us maybe get a little bit closer to that agreement today. But I'm sure that I speak for everyone at our table today when I say that I'm deeply concerned about the growing risk of drinking water contamination. That risk is compounded by the threat of underinvestment in drinking water systems should Congress adopt President Trump's proposed budget for the next fiscal year, by EPA's longstanding failure to issue new drinking water standards, and by that agency's recent actions to rescind the clean water drinking rule. The lead crisis in Flint, Michigan that Senator Duckworth has referred to is it's a city where I think about 40% of our residents live in poverty. And that crisis began, as you'll recall, in 2014 when a state government official decided to switch the city's drinking water supply. And our networks, our newspapers were flooded with images of families holding up jugs of discolored water that came from their kitchen sinks, came from their bathtubs. And it was like we were actually watching a nightmare unfold overnight. But in reality, switching Flint's water sources without adding the proper water treatment chemicals unleashed contaminants from the system that had been present in the city's pipes for many, many years. And for decades, cities across our country have struggled to fund. Got a mayor of a big city, my next door neighbor, Senator Booker. But for decades, cities across our country have struggled to fund proper maintenance of their drinking water infrastructure. In Flint, officials repeatedly cut corners with little regard to public health concerns in order to avoid investing in a high-quality water system. But really, what's more important than investment in making sure that our kids, and we, are not drinking water that slowly stunts the growth of our kids and the growth of their brains? And while the national spotlight is focused on Flint, unfortunately, as we know, aging water infrastructure is a growing problem facing far too many of our communities, including in Delaware. And last year, the Guardian newspaper found that over the past decade, water departments in at least 33 large cities have chosen to test their water with methods that underestimate the lead levels in that drinking water. And an investigation by Reuters found some 449 communities in this country with lead levels in their drinking water that were higher than those found in Flint. Congress banned lead water pipes about 3 decades ago, but many of our local utility systems are older than that, as you know. In fact, we don't even know the full extent of the problem. Estimates of the number of lead service lines still in use range from 3 to as much as 10 million. And EPA estimates the drinking water funding needs across the country total about $600 billion over a 20-year period. And to address that need requires an investment of about $30 billion annually. The proposed fiscal year 2018 budget for EPA and the U.S. Department of Ag, USDA, drinking water programs total less than $1 billion. It's not going to cut the mustard. In fact, it's not even close. And I hope that today's discussion will begin to tackle a number of these issues, but in the effort to address contaminants in drinking water from aging infrastructure, this is only the tip of the iceberg. State and local governments are already strapped for resources, but we have to address these concerns. And I often say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and no place is that truer than with regard to maintaining our critical local infrastructure. We've got to find a way to help make sure that parents can feel safe, confident about the glass of water that they give their kids at the dining table and anywhere else. And with that, I'm happy I would describe myself as a recovering governor and an old naval flight officer as well. I don't know if we describe Senator Booker as a recovering mayor, but he was a mayor and quite a good one. And he still thinks a little bit like a mayor, which I think for all of us is a good thing. Senator Booker.
Thank you very much. I've got limited time, and I'm much more interested in hearing you all speak than hearing myself. I think the Reuters report, if I remember correctly, was a lot more dramatic than that, with over 1,000 localities with more than 3 times the blood lead levels than you saw in Flint, Michigan. We have kids in Newark that are, and Camden, frankly, that are drinking out of bottled water because of the lead problems in our schools. This is a national crisis of profound proportions. As you said, I'm not only a recovering mayor, I'm a recovering city council person. And when I started in the city council in Newark, New Jersey, we had epidemic lead levels in our city. And to see a parent with a child who's suffering from lead poisoning and knowing that those effects are permanent, much of the life effects, it's astonishing. So if a foreign government came in here and poisoned our children, we would put the resources forward perhaps to fight that and the effects. But this is a consistent problem we've had in America for years now, and we don't seem to have the moral will to deal with the crisis that we have. I'm so grateful for Senator Duckworth's partnership and leadership on this issue, and obviously, Chairman, I know you're ranking member now, but you're always my chairman. I just appreciate your leadership as well, but I'd much rather hear from the experts that are assembled here, especially that my time is short.
Thank you, Senator Booker. I'm going to ask our witnesses to present your remarks, and we'll start with Dr. Mark Edwards. He is an expert on water treatment and corrosion. His research on elevated lead levels in Washington, D.C.'s municipal water supply gained national attention, changed the city's recommendations on water use in homes with lead service pipes. And he is considered one of the world's leading experts in water corrosion in home plumbing and a nationally recognized expert on copper corrosion. He's also one of the lead scientists in the Flint water crisis, and that is where I am most familiar with your work and your testimony before the House OGR Committee. So thank you for being here, Dr. Edwards.
Thank you for having me. 100 years ago, America's drinking water treatment and water distribution system were the envy of the world. And over the last 50 years, unfortunately, our underinvestment and complacency have created problems that rival those in developing countries. No one ever brags about winning a game of Monopoly by investing in waterworks. And to amplify what Senator Duckworth said, there are never ribbon-cutting ceremonies when we upgrade a water main. But there should be, because these water pipes, they are a bulwark of civilization. And if you ignore it, civilization as we know it ends, just like it did for residents in Flint, Michigan, St. Joe, Louisiana, and Ranger, Texas in the last year. These are residents of our poorest rural American cities, our post-industrial cities, and for decades they really had no choice but to borrow from tomorrow to pay for today. And eventually they could not afford to meet existing federal water safety laws. Much less, they couldn't afford to upgrade their pipes to meet new standards for conservation and for water safety. So these Americans, they need our help. And we can do it proactively, or we can do it reactively as water crises continue to be exposed in these poor rural American towns and post-industrial cities. And in some cases, let me tell you, outside money is going to be required. It's necessary so that all Americans can enjoy access to safe, clean, and most importantly, in some cases, affordable water. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Ms. Bentanzo, is that correct? I'm also familiar with your work because you, to me, are an example of the public servants that we have in our government that are unseen and unheard, who oftentimes have to act in a very courageous way, going against your own bureaucracy and some of the inertia that happens in bureaucracy, and also in going up against your higher ranking folks who want to put things on the back burner. And for those who don't know, Ms. Bentanzo was critical in uncovering the Flint water crisis in August of 2015, because she was the one who championed, encouraged, often against opposition, the completion of a study that discovered the elevated lead levels in children who were living in Flint at the time. And after nearly a decade of service at the EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water, you now lead a small firm called Safe Water Engineering, where you work to improve access to safe drinking water through engineering and policy consulting. And you continue to raise awareness of lead in drinking water and improve public health protections of safe drinking water regulations and legislations at the federal and state level. So I just want to thank you for your work, because so often civil servants are maligned, but here's one who was very heroic in the work that she did. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here today. So safe drinking water and the water infrastructure that delivers it is fundamental to protecting public health and serving thriving communities and economies that can grow because they're able to rely on steady, safe water supply. So there have been plenty of conversations here on Capitol Hill and some statements here today about the need for increased investment in our water infrastructure, and I agree wholeheartedly. But new infrastructure alone isn't going to get us to reliable, safe water that we want. We also need stronger, more effective drinking water regulations, as well as investment in the people who operate water utilities and the people who oversee our drinking water programs. The Flint water crisis is the perfect example of how these three issues, a weak water regulation, aging water infrastructure, and insufficient drinking water oversight programs, collided to create a disaster. A 2013 study by the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators estimates that state agencies that operate the public water system supervision programs need 2,300 more FTE just to fulfill their basic program requirements.
Say that again.
2,300 additional FTE to meet their basic program requirements. The states actually identify areas of their programs that they won't emphasize because they don't have enough resources to complete all their obligations. So all of us suffer as a result of this. We need people at the states to ensure that the water utilities are meeting all their requirements under the Safe Drinking Water Act. EPA also needs to provide effective oversight and provide effective backup to the states. The EPA reviews the state implementation programs on site about every 5 to 6 years, and the last time the EPA reviewed Michigan's program prior to the Flint water crisis was in 2010. So that is simply too long to go between on-site checks because they're flagging statewide implementation errors that are affecting drinking water quality across the entire state. So they need to be able to provide more frequent review of those programs. The lead and copper rule is a perfect example of how oversight and interaction between the state and the water utility is necessary to assure proper compliance. As you senators had already mentioned, there are examples across the country that show water systems may not be meeting their sampling requirements. The states need to have the resources to go on site and verify that they are meeting all the sampling requirements under the lead and copper rule, to verify that they're truly sampling at the high-risk homes that have lead service lines, because that wasn't the case in Flint. It's obvious from the Flint and DC lead crises that there's a need to revise the lead and copper rule to prevent these situations from happening again. And as we sit here, the EPA is working on a revision, and they're working with recommendations from the National Drinking Water Advisory Council. Some of their recommendations, though, from that NDWAC council would make it more difficult to identify or prevent another lead crisis from occurring. The NDWAC recommendations don't address any of the key lead and copper rule weaknesses that allowed the DC and Flint lead crises to happen. They would eliminate all planned sampling at high-risk homes and rely only on customer requests for sampling. And that's no way to identify a water quality concern before it becomes a crisis, and it's no way to learn from the preventable tragedies that happen in Flint and in Washington, D.C. So only sampling for lead on a regular basis at high-risk homes will let water utilities know if lead corrosion is increasing. This and comprehensive corrosion control studies for all treatment and source water changes are needed to prevent another lead crisis or any other water quality crisis. And so in summary, we need for any increased investment in water infrastructure to be effective, we need more effective drinking water regulations, more oversight from the states, and we need all three of these to provide the safe drinking water that the people of Flint, Michigan, Washington, D.C., Ranger, Texas, all need and deserve.
Next up is Ms. Mary Beth Heller, who is the who served as Assistant Commissioner of Environmental Health in the Division of Disease Control for the City of Baltimore's Health Department, and you've been there since February of 2012. Previously, you worked for the Baltimore City Health Department as a Special Assistant City Solicitor, where you tried cases for the city against property owners who failed to comply with orders to remove lead-based paint in households where children had experienced elevated lead levels. You also served as the Director of Baltimore's Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program and as the Mayor's Lead Coordinator. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Make sure your mic's on. You should have a red light. Do you see a red light?
Thank you. Thank you all.
We don't want to miss a word.
I really want to talk to you today about my personal experience in Baltimore City in working on this issue. It was when I was an assistant state's attorney and a special assistant city solicitor trying to achieve abatement in lead-contaminated homes in Baltimore City, where landlords had refused or simply neglected or ignored orders to actually abate those property of lead hazards. At the time, there was, and there still is, a significant number of children who are poisoned in Baltimore City through lead-contaminated dust as a result of living in this deteriorated housing. But I first became aware of the water issue when I was approached by then Health Commissioner Dr. Peter Bielenson, and he stated that apparently the NAACP, along with some school parents, were looking to sue the city of Baltimore for allowing city schools to have lead-contaminated water and to allow that to continue. Obviously, I was very shocked by this, and the parents were rightly outraged. And at this moment, I must say, it was Mr. Larry Gaines and also Mr. Williams who brought this to the forefront. I learned in investigating this that the process for attempting to deal with lead in water had actually been going on for years in city schools. When the national recall for lead-lined coolers was issued, city schools put forth a tremendous effort to identify, inventory, and replace those coolers. They identified high levels in a small group of schools, and for these schools, parts replacement and flushing protocols were set up. But later they were discontinued because there really wasn't any one key lead person providing the oversight. The other issue was, what do we do about it? How do we stop it? So Dr. Bielenson asked me to draft an order ordering all of the fountains to be shut off until they could meet EPA recommendations. Bottled water was brought into city schools. At that point then, a massive effort was undertaken, again, to repair, replace, and test water. Over 10,000 tests were ultimately taken of water samples over the course of several years. It cost approximately $5 million with consultants working to try and remedy this problem. But it was very difficult for me. Ultimately, because of the previous efforts, sort of the now it's fixed, now it isn't, now it's fixed, now it isn't, and then the health department having to step in and actually order the fountains off, there was really no credibility from anyone speaking on behalf of city schools with regard to this issue. I was asked at that time if I would be interested in going there because I was with the health department and had worked with tenants and had worked with the department. So I went over to manage that program, and I found myself, as these different efforts were taking place, that you could literally have two water fountains with replacement parts that were next to each other on the very same wall, and one would pass and one would fail. And I would find myself in the very difficult and rather ridiculous position of trying to explain to a parent that this remediation had occurred, yet there's a giant sign over one that says do not drink water, and the other one says approved by the health department. And this continued. Whenever fountain parts were broken, a new part would have to be put on. I learned, shockingly, that lead-free actually meant that these parts and fixtures could contain up to 8% lead. That's not lead-free by anyone's envisioning. Later, that level was actually reduced in 2011. But I think the thing I want to really bring up today is that for those cities that have tried, for the school system in particular, where remediation efforts have gone sort of on and off over the years, where even filtration systems are now installed in several schools. And the health department just recently redid testing, and of those 7 schools where their filtration system, we still had 4 samples that failed. It defies belief. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that those were done before 2011, even though they're new by most standards of infrastructure, that those fixtures still contain that amount of lead. So what Baltimore City and city school systems really needs is the funding to actually and finally replace these parts, these fixtures, with parts that are in fact lead-free. And it will be extremely expensive. But I had to ultimately, when I left city schools, because they discontinued the water program in terms of even trying anymore, it was literally just dumping money into something that you could not look a parent in the face and say, this will work. I couldn't do it in good conscience. So I just said, unless a school is being completely renovated, all new pipes, a filtration system, if you can't do that, then they just have to go back on bottled water. I can't look a parent in the face and make this argument, even though I know that this one is safe and this one isn't. So that's really what I came here to talk about today, is fixing it is not necessarily permanent, and it's extremely challenging, and it's very hard to maintain credibility, and it's very hard to explain to the public why you can't just replace the fountains. They think you're negligent, stupid. Why can't you just do it? Thank you.
Thank you. We can certainly hear your passion and know that you've been in this fight a long time. Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Joaquin Esquivel, who was appointed to the State Water Resources Control Board by Governor Jerry Brown in March of 2017, and who previously served as Assistant Secretary for Federal Water Policy at the California Natural Resources Agency, where he helped develop policy priorities between the agency, the governor's office, the California congressional delegation, and federal stakeholder agencies. Boy, that is quite a job description. For more than 8 years prior to that, he worked for U.S. Senator Barbara Boxer of California. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Duckworth.
Barbara,
I'm sorry, what's that?
what did you do for Senator Boxer?
When I left, I handled agricultural policy, water, Native American issues, nutrition, and was an IT director. So
That was all?
that was all. Well, thank you, senators, for convening this discussion. You know, as Senator Duckworth was saying, water is extremely personal. It is one of those issues that really gets to the emotions of people, particularly when you're talking about safe drinking water. By way of a little bit of background, the State Water Resources Control Board actually has purview over all water quality and water rights in the state of California. And as of 2014, we also run the drinking water program, which previously was held in the Department of Public Health. So the board is unique in an institution insofar as its broad authority to protect water quality and all the beneficial uses of water in the state. And it's an incredible challenge because it is a balance amongst those beneficial uses. And as some of our speakers here today and colleagues were saying, you know, it is about public trust as well. You know, public trust in institutions to be able to deliver safe and clean drinking water. And it's not a one-time fix. It's an ongoing issue, and it's an ongoing problem. And the heart of it is, how do you finance the work that needs to get done? You know, for us in California in 2012, we actually passed what's known as a human right to water, which in its ideal, I think is well-meaning, but the question is, what does that mean for then regulatory agencies? What actions does that then become incumbent upon the state to take in order to ensure a human right to water? And so for us at the state board, we've really focused in on affordability and also just, you know, we have issues with lead in California as well, but coming out of the drought, which, you know, this wasn't California's drought, it's not our last. We have an incredible amount of attention that's been paid by the constituents in California on water policy to great effect. We were able to save 25% of urban water use when it was mandated by the governor. And that's, you know, to get all of California to save 25% of their water use was an incredible lift. But it also highlighted many communities that have been struggling with drinking water quality issues for years, that the drought simply exacerbated, particularly in the Central Valley, where you have many small water utilities, sometimes servicing 15 or less or 100 or less, and don't have the ratepayer base in order to put in the infrastructure that's needed to ensure that contaminants in often the groundwater that they're pumping is taken care of. So, so again, you know, in 2015, we actually came out with a resilient, affordable, and safe drinking water for disadvantaged communities framework, which is a mouthful. But for the first time, again, try to simply assess what are the suite of tools that we need in order to address what are long-standing drinking water issues in our poor, rural, and disadvantaged communities. And part of it goes to this issue of oftentimes, whether it's a disadvantaged community or simply a service district that doesn't have the ratepayer base to spread those costs to, it's an issue of perhaps consolidation, voluntary consolidation. But then also, how do we better use SRFs and innovate with the financing tools that we have to get more? And by getting more, it really does take, not just looking at single issue contaminants, how do you address lead, which is critical, but how do you look at a watershed-wide sort of approach to water management, where you're looking at headwater management to improve the water quality coming off of the streams or rivers that may be your primary source, or look at its interaction with groundwater. And all of this takes capacity. It takes a tremendous amount of dollars, research, and simply getting the studies done in the case of trying to understand what our situations even are. So, not to say that it is the challenge before us is how do we deal with the fact that there are no magic pots of money, that it is going to take alignment between local, state, and federal dollars, alignment of policies, aligning of funding and priorities, and also just certainty on the federal side. It becomes hard for states and localities, and I'm sure you know this, Senator Booker, when you have this fluctuation up and down from the federal side of the funds, it makes it hard to plan, and it is about life cycle planning. How do we look at our infrastructure that we have an incredible system in the state of California and in the rest of in this country that has taken us, decades and decades to build, and we're endangering that now by underfunding and undercutting the investments that we need to continue to be making. So the question becomes, how do we look at the next 40 years, the next 50 years, and really plan out and get some good coordination to achieve what are multiple goals and priorities from many different agencies. In California alone, we have somewhere around 3,000 various agencies that deliver water or touch water policy in some way in the state. And it's a challenge to make sure you have those folks all be aligned on some goals and priorities. But anyway, thank you for this opportunity simply to address, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Ms. Chris Sturm, who directs New Jersey's Future Water Program to upgrade urban water infrastructure, mainstream green infrastructure, and facilitate Jersey waterworks. She also leads New Jersey's Futures policy development and advocacy across a host of issues, including sustainable infrastructure, climate resilience, regional planning, and incentives for compact, equitable growth. Her career experience includes serving as the Assistant Director of the Capital City Redevelopment Corporation, as well as working for the MSM Regional Council and the Office of State Planning. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. So New Jersey Future promotes smart infrastructure.
Who would you say is maybe the best mayor of a large New Jersey city that you've ever met?
Sitting right in front of me,
Oh,
the
okay.
great
Thank
city of Newark,
I
New
just wanted
Jersey.
to get that on the record. Thank you.
We just, that's right. So we promote smart infrastructure and support of strong communities, cities like Newark that are revitalizing. And we also facilitate this collaborative. We have over 300 members representing both cities, public and private water utilities, community and environmental groups, labor, all dedicated to seeing our water infrastructure upgraded. But I'm here to talk about lead and how bad it is in New Jersey. We have over 200,000 children with some level of lead in their blood, and of those, nearly 6,000 have elevated levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter, the level that CDC identifies as a level of concern. Test results from school districts are just coming in. They're actually due today. And we did a preliminary data analysis of the first 55 and saw that they were from across the state, rural, urban, suburban, and that on average, 9% of the drinking water outlets in each of those schools was testing positive for lead. So we'll have fuller results in August that we look forward to sharing. But kids go from school to home, where they again encounter water that's contaminated with lead, along with pregnant women, nursing mothers, and caregivers that are making formula with tap water, which is terrifying. New Jersey has an estimated 350,000 homes and small businesses that have lead service lines, ranking 5th across the nation. And approximately 1/3 of the state's water systems use corrosion control chemicals to try to prevent lead contamination. But still, we have at this moment 40 public community water systems that are in violation of the federal action level and haven't yet come into compliance. So what can the federal government do? I just want to suggest some actions in 3 areas. First, testing and transparency. EPA does need to upgrade the lead and copper rule. The EPA should also require states to share compilations of school testing results. New Jersey Future is doing it with interns because the state government is not doing it. They're on individual websites across the state. Congress should pass legislation, including that proposed by Senators Booker and Duckworth, to help fund school testing and remediation, which is expensive and difficult. The federal government should also require property owners to test their water systems and disclose results at the time of sale. Second area, the nation must commit to the full replacement of lead service lines. New federal funds are needed to jumpstart these upgrades and assist low-income communities through state revolving funds. And through programs like New Jersey's, which has just set aside $30 million, it's a good start, but it's not enough and we'll need more funding. Third, we need public information campaigns. I've been astounded in preparing for this hearing in the lack of awareness and action. We need elected officials, mayors, governors, and really thank you all for your leadership on this issue, to convince the public to take action. This is indeed a public health crisis, and we should all be clamoring for drinking water upgrades to support thriving, healthy communities. Unfortunately, lead in drinking water, as my colleagues have noted, is not the nation's only water infrastructure problem. Across New Jersey, aging drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater systems are resulting in combined sewer overflows and backups into homes and streets. We have water and sewer main breaks that stymie commutes and shut down businesses, leaking pipes, and so on. The federal government must reestablish a full partnership with states and communities, the kind of partnership that really helped us transform water quality back in the 1980s. States are ready to partner. For example, New Jersey's bipartisan legislative task force on drinking water infrastructure is poised to release recommendations this fall, and Assemblyman McKeon sends his regards. So on behalf of New Jersey Future and Jersey Waterworks, thank you so much for your leadership on this issue. We are committed to working with you to help ensure that all kids are growing up with clean tap water and lifelong good health. There's more details in the packet, but again, thank you.
Thank you. The ranking member has very generously agreed to let the Senator Booker go next. So you have to leave almost immediately, and then Senator Cardin next, because he also has to leave in about 15 minutes.
I'm really grateful, and Chris, thank you so much for being here. I know how busy you are, and all of you all. I think it's on. Is it on?
Is the red light on?
The red light is on, sir.
You're on.
All right.
You're on.
All right. So I just want to talk about the mandatory testing that's going on in New Jersey and why that's good, but also the challenges it brings up for our state. Can you elucidate that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the testing is great. I think a lot of these systems the schools haven't been required to do it. So they're doing it now, and let's just look at Newark for a minute, which is really the canary in the coal mine among schools in New Jersey. They found in March of last year that 30 of the 67 schools had lead in drinking water. They'd been aware of this for some time, but after Flint, they couldn't ignore it anymore. And so worked really closely with our DEP to notify immediately parents and put results on the web. They then spent $1 million, as you know, to test 8,000 outlets and pinpoint, where the problems were. Spent $80,000 on bottled drinking water, and have spent, as of last March, $50,000 on remediation, which is like a drop in the bucket. And in talking to Valerie Wilson, who's the business administrator in the school district, she's a real hero. I mean, they were facing budget shortfalls before lead came along. And now she's faced with this task that Mary Beth explained of figuring out how to remediate. It's a process of elimination, so you've got the faucet or the drinking fountain, and you can replace that, and then you retest, and then you might still have lead. And so then you've got these old schools that are big, and they've got pipes, and you don't know where the solder is or where the lead pipe is, and so you're ripping up walls, and at what point do you stop? Huge need for technical assistance and funding, especially in low-income communities where kids are getting lead from other sources. I mean, we all know soil, paint, even food has lead in it. And so drinking water, we can control that. We need to control it.
And I mean, that's the challenge, right? I was in Alabama last month, and just seeing the fact that they don't even have, in Lowndes County, for example, sewage systems at all. The raw sewage running behind people's houses. And I know we're focused on lead, but there are a whole bunch of other water issues that we have in New Jersey, a relatively wealthier state.
Yeah.
And in some senses, the mandatory testing, which I'm proud to be working with the senator on, but it's gonna really point out the billions of dollars of liabilities we have, correct?
Absolutely. So New Jersey has 21 cities that have combined sewer systems, and we're finally catching up to the rest of the country in that they're now required to figure out how to upgrade these systems. So we're not dumping raw sewage into rivers and bays. It's not backing up into basements and streets. Cities like Newark and Jersey City and others, they're the state's economic leaders, outperforming the rest of the state in population and job growth, but they're also poor, on average, hosting like double their share of the state's population below the poverty line. So they're really going to be challenged to upgrade these systems in a way that doesn't stop the revitalization that's happening. They've got to be building their tax bases at the same time they're doing this.
And so just two final points I'd love for you to make, and then I'll be done. One is and the reason why I have so much respect for the work you do is how you all are engaging low-income communities. Can you talk about the importance of engagement? But then there's another type of engagement I would imagine everybody would agree there just doesn't seem to be the will at this point to deal with the national will to deal with this crisis. It's not an understanding of the degree of the crisis. And I've learned the old axiom down here in Washington is that change doesn't come from Washington, it comes to Washington. People demanding it. And so you're doing grassroots community engagement. I'd like to hear maybe a little bit about that, but then maybe in my conclusion, just can you talk about how do we go about getting this to become a national sense of urgency where we actually address a real health problem that's undermining the success of our children, families, putting seniors at risk? What do you think needs to happen so we can get real movement on this in Congress?
Yeah, okay, that's an easy question. One type of work that we're doing, which is really exciting, is going to the people in these communities that have these combined sewer systems and educating them about it and asking them, where do you want like green infrastructure, things like parks that are capturing stormwater where it falls, where do you need more street trees and so on? Because the public works expenditure on those sewer system fixes is going to be one of the biggest things in their community in a generation, and they should be having a say in how that money is spent. It shouldn't all be below the ground. Some of it has to be above the ground. And so I think that work is really the key to the answer to your second question. As you said, the demand needs to come from citizens, and so engaging people in these conversations is really important. But we also need leaders. We're going to have a new governor in New Jersey soon, and we're hopeful that he will take on this issue of lead. It's like seat belts or smoking or drunk driving. You need multi-pronged approach, and I think somebody else addressed that as well, where you've got the message coming from the top, you've got the demand, like the drunk driving mothers, right, those mothers from the bottom, and then you've got regulation and enforcement and resources. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Cardin.
First, Senator Duckworth, thank you for your leadership here, and it's great to be here with my colleagues. Senator Carper is our great leader here on the Environment and Public Works Committee, and we thank him for keeping us united in our mission to improve our environment and deal with the safety of our drinking water, our clean water, and our public health. So I thank all of our witnesses, but I particularly want to acknowledge Mary Beth Holler from Baltimore. She made that long trip, as the chairman knows, all the way from Baltimore here, and had to fight the traffic. But thank you very much for being here, and we thank all of you. I know Mary Beth talked about the problems in the Baltimore City schools, and I'm going to get back to that in one moment. I think everybody knows about Freddie Gray and the terrible episode that happened in Baltimore with the police and the mishandling of him. He was a person who was known to the police. He had a history of just not being terribly coordinated. What was not told about him is that he was poisoned. He suffered from lead poisoning. And lots of people have been exposed to lead in Baltimore, in Maryland, and around our nation. And we need to have more transparency and more testing. Now, in Maryland, we're going to test every 1- and 2-year-old in our state because we know that all of our children are at risk. So we're going to take on this issue, but I want to underscore the importance of our water infrastructure. Baltimore, our average age of our water infrastructure is over 50 years old. In fact, we found recently, Senator Carper, a wood pipe that was currently being used in Baltimore. So we have some very old facilities. And of course, there are hundreds of thousands of water main breaks every year in the United States, which is that creates a lot of public health. We had River Road in Montgomery County that was a river not too many years ago when there was a water main break. We had to evacuate people. So it's a public health risk. It's a waste of resources. It's costly. And we need to deal with this. So as we talk about modernizing the infrastructure in America, let's not forget about water infrastructure and make sure that's part of this debate. It's not just roads, bridges, transit systems. It's our water infrastructure. And I want to talk a little bit about our schools. Yes, in Baltimore, we have a problem. And as you point out, it's the lead pipes that come from very safe city water into our schools that are not safe because of the last connections. And Baltimore, like a lot of more challenged communities from the point of view of resources, does not have the resources to correct this. And Baltimore City is an LEA. The entire city represents one school district. And when you look at the age of our facilities in Baltimore compared to the age of our facilities around the rest of our state, Baltimore has much older facilities for our kids. And yet, they don't have the resources to improve it. We had our superintendent of schools here yesterday before our federal delegation. And she was telling us that they had to take $30 million out of their school budget just to deal with school maintenance, even though it should be a state responsibility. No other state LEA has that burden. So I just would ask Mary Beth, can you just tell us what is the prospects here in our country, looking at what's going on in Baltimore, if we're going to be able to deal with modernizing our facilities in poorer communities so that they're not exposed to lead?
Well, I mean, I'm not entirely optimistic. I mean, money is the issue. Unless there's increased funding and the dollars to be made available to actually replace these systems, it's going to be this continual trial and error kind of remediation and replacement. So in terms of Baltimore City, I know that the public schools are now looking at potentially replacing or rather installing point-of-use filtration at each of the fountains, as opposed to point-of-entry filtration systems, which really need to be done when there's a major renovation going on, which was one of the recommendations. You know, it would be too expensive to do a small school. It may cost $100,000 to retrofit. A large school, it might be $500,000 to actually replace the plumbing that is in the school. So what they're looking at now is, because there really isn't the funding for that, is point-of-use filtration. So, and that, I think that could be a potential solution for Baltimore City in terms of the public school.
And I thank you for that. Our Democratic caucus in the last Congress came together on what's known as a bill called True Leadership. I helped coordinate it. It was bills by many members of our caucus that dealt with the transparency and standards on lead. It dealt also with resources for basic water infrastructure, increasing it dramatically. It did deal with the connections between water supplies and buildings, particularly at schools where children are in low-income communities. It did deal with a lot of these different areas. We got some of it into the Water Resources Development Act, but we still have a long way to go. And I just point, I mean, when I look at the schools in poorer school districts around the country and what our children, we wouldn't want to work in those buildings, and yet we're sending our children to these facilities, and they're at risk. And we need to do better. So I thank you for coming here, and can tell you that we are committed not to modernizing water infrastructure, because all of us are at risk. All of us are at risk. And we take a look at the Clean Water Rule that was withdrawn by the Trump administration. That puts a lot of drinking water for millions of Americans at risk, and we can do better.
Thank you. Do you want to do a question? The ranking member may have to step out briefly, but he'll be back, so I'm going to go ahead and ask my questions. Ms. Bentanzo, from your remarks, you made it clear that our drinking water systems require significant investments to keep them in working order. As we consider which policies are essential for strategic infrastructure investments, what can we do to make sure that water systems are more resilient and able to meet changing needs? Are there special considerations needed to protect water quality?
So the majority of our water systems in this country were built in the beginning to the middle of the last century, and they were all designed at a time when we thought we could deal with water quality at the treatment plant. So the treatment plants were designed to deal with water quality, and the distribution system is for quantity, making sure that you get that water out. Most of our distribution systems are designed to meet fire flow, and there was no consideration of water quality. So now we've got these oversized pipes and water ages in the distribution system. We now know that there are water quality issues. We have disinfection byproducts that increase in the distribution system. We have microbial growth. There's opportunistic pathogens, and we've got corrosion and leaching of our distribution system materials. So it's not okay anymore to think that we're dealing with all of the contaminants at the treatment plant. We need to put that consideration into the distribution system. So when we're doing infrastructure upgrades and replacing pipes, it can't be just a one-for-one, here's your new pipe. We need to reconsider how our distribution systems are designed to ensure that they are addressing the water quality needs. So more redundancy, smaller pipes, in some cases, different sources will be appropriate. We want to consider all of our water infrastructure together. So how much water we use from the drinking water system is going to influence the wastewater piping needs, and then if you can supplement with on-site water reuse, then it decreases your stormwater needs. So as we look towards our water infrastructure upgrades, we need to consider all of those systems at the same time and do some fundamental redesign and not just kind of blindly replacing the infrastructure that's in place.
Thank you, thank you. Several panelists have mentioned the need to update the lead and copper rule, and Congress has been waiting for updates for some time. I'd like to ask all of our panelists, and perhaps starting with Dr. Edwards and moving on down, what would you like to see in the revised rule?
Well, I think Ms. Batanza laid it out very clearly that we need to fix many of the loopholes that are in the existing rule so that something like happened in Flint, Michigan and Washington, D.C. is caught earlier and is not legal. And some of the changes that have been proposed in the draft regulation would eliminate future water crises because you won't know they're occurring, the way the new sampling is being proposed. We certainly do need money to start replacing these lead pipes, and we need honest public education that informs people of the risk and also their responsibility that they have to protect themselves from lead in water, which even if the cities, as of today, do everything in their power, it still falls on individual consumers to take steps to protect themselves and their families.
Can you speak a little bit to the sampling methodology? I want you to expand on that part of your answer. And I just, one of the pieces of legislation I've introduced is called Get the Lead Out, which says that you should also do blood testing of children in schools, but also just how you can get around actually finding hazardous levels of contaminants by just how you test.
Okay.
And you certainly saw that in Flint.
Yes, so the entire lead and copper rule is based on the provision that you can protect an entire city's drinking water by sampling very few homes. In a city like Washington, D.C., they only have to sample 100 homes every 3 years, for example. And in order for that to work, you have to find and sample the worst homes in the city. And if those meet the existing law, then it's reasonable to extrapolate and say that other homes in the city are okay. And unfortunately, as the Guardian article pointed out, too many cities are not testing the worst case homes using the worst case approaches. They've come up with ways of sampling homes that tend to have lower lead or use protocols that miss the lead that's normally present when people drink the water. And as we saw in Flint, Michigan, even as National Guard were walking the street and distributing bottled water, and you had neighborhoods of children with elevated blood lead, Flint was meeting the lead and copper rule. They were doing that because they used all these tricks and were not sampling the worst case homes. And it fell upon parents in Flint to sample their own water and to figure out children were being lead poisoned and that the city was not meeting the lead and copper rule. And so, too, that's how the Washington, D.C. lead crisis was exposed about a decade ago. So we really need to fix these loopholes so that the official testing is done, is accomplishing its objectives. And unfortunately, some of the revisions of the lead and copper rule that are being proposed are just going to throw that out completely. And something like Flint and Washington, D.C. would no longer even violate the law.
Can you elaborate what the proposal is?
The proposal is to focus on lead pipe replacement, which is a worthy goal, but it also wants to get rid of the existing sampling scheme entirely and just rely on sampling of homes on a hit or miss basis without any systematic evaluation of what that means for safety across the city.
Ms. Batanza, anything for the lead and copper rule?
Yeah. So in the revised lead and copper rule, I would like it to meet 3 goals. One is to get the lead out. We just need to have lead not in contact with our drinking water. We need to reduce risk of lead exposure while we're getting the lead out, because we know there are so many lead pipes in service that even in a best case scenario, that's going to take 20 to 30 years. So we need to protect the public health while we're getting the lead out, and we need to prevent the next lead crisis. So for getting the lead out, we need to do full lead service line replacement. Right now, Most water systems are doing partial lead service line replacement. It's expensive, and it can actually increase exposure to lead in drinking water. And this is because most water utilities only have authority to replace what's on the public property and not what's on the private property. This is definitely the case for the state of Michigan, the city of Lansing accepted. They actually have a different city ordinance there, and they've been able to do full lead service line replacement for the entire city of Lansing. But nationwide, we need to come up with a way to achieve full lead service line replacement and get rid of this partial lead service line replacement, because what we're doing now is hurting public health, and it's expensive. Protecting public health while we're getting the lead out, that's improving corrosion control and getting lead as low as possible, and making sure all water systems are doing this, not just those that serve over 50,000 as required in the current lead and copper rule. And then preventing the next lead crisis is increasing sampling requirements. This every 3 years thing is not frequent enough to identify if water quality is changing. So increasing sampling and doing the comprehensive water quality studies when we're making source water and treatment changes is absolutely critical to preventing the next lead crisis.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists?
I would just add for Baltimore City, the lead and copper rule, in Baltimore City schools, they don't test for copper. It's not a public water system. They're a direct consumer of the Department of Public Works, which is the public water system. So I think that it might be worth exploring, changing that and including large institutions in some way, even though they're not public water systems. I also could not agree more with what Dr. Edwards said regarding the sample size of what is considered to be, representative, even though the Department of Public Works makes efforts to seek out, and we have a bounty of housing that would qualify, so they don't have to look far. But I would really like to see the sample size increased greatly.
Thank you.
The only comment I would make is just to put an asterisk on the transparency side and the frequency of testing. In the state, the board has put together a My Water Quality portal so that homeowners can go and understand the actual quality of the water coming into their homes. Although, again, in-home testing is required in order to be able to better understand the constituents that are then coming into because of piping within the house. But the transparency side of things is really critical, again, for ensuring that we maintain the public trust when it comes to water quality in these communities. So,
Sturm, you specifically brought up the lead and copper rule, so
Yeah,
please.
yeah, and I would build on, what the other folks have said, but I met with our New Jersey DEP on Monday, and they've hired a whole bunch of people just to deal with this issue, because what they found is that the plans that the utilities had were really out of date. There are no records of inventories, which is required under the lead and copper rule. I shouldn't say there are no, but there are few inventory showing where lead service lines actually are. And that's a labor-intensive task, but we need to know where they are so we know how big the problem is. So that's part of it. They're also requiring utilities to certify that their sampling and water quality parameter plans are compliant, and then they are hiring all these people to review them. They found that only about 1% are compliant. So the reviewing task is really big. There's a lot of education and technical assistance going on. And they're attaching expiration dates to those plans so that they'll be redone. So there's a lot of room for improvement. And the other thing, and I don't know if it falls under the rule, but not only schools, but child care centers are so important because it's those young brains that are so vulnerable. And they're not captured under the lead and copper rule. And I don't know if that's the right mechanism or...
So many of them are private.
Private and public. Yeah, New Jersey's Division of Children and Families just issued a regulation last month requiring them to do testing, but that's not nationwide, so.
Thank you. The National Drinking Water Advisory Council gave the EPA a set of recommendations on the lead and copper rule revisions. Is anybody familiar with what those recommendations might be, and do you think, you're nodding, so can you maybe expand on it a little bit? And do you think that they will address some of the issues that we're talking about if the EPA were to follow the recommendations from the National Drinking Water Advisory Council?
Well, I think those were the proposed things that Mark had just been talking
Okay,
about
specific, okay.
a few minutes ago. But So there's definitely the concern about the sampling approach that they've proposed in that set of recommendations that would definitely prevent identifying the next lead crisis. Another thing that they've proposed in that set is going to a household action level. We're kind of removing this focus on that system-wide sampling, but looking at the house. And so what that ends up doing is kind of putting the onus on the homeowner. They need to know to request sampling themselves. If there's a lead problem there, it's because of their household plumbing, and it doesn't give the water system any motivation to look holistically across the water system to see if it's a failure in corrosion control that's resulting in this hit in this individual home. So it kind of shifts the whole philosophy of the lead and copper rule to put more of the responsibility on the homeowner and less on the water utility, and that's exactly the opposite of what we need.
Right, and let me elaborate. The recommendations really focused on getting the lead out that the cities and governments own across the country, removing the city-owned part of the lead pipe. And frankly, the rest of the regulation is a message that tells the homeowner, you're on your own. It's your responsibility to protect yourself from any lead that might be in your home plumbing, even though our water has a contributing cause to that lead release. And let me just make sure people understand here. When we talk about antiquated infrastructure, lead pipes were banned in 1986. Lead solder was banned in 1986. But we were still willfully adding lead to brass in plumbing that was installed to January 2014.
Oh, my goodness.
And so when you talk about antiquated infrastructure in the schools, anything built after January 2014 is the first time that we think that there was no lead willfully added to the brass. And what's more, there's still normal amounts of lead, ambient amounts of lead that occur in that. And so Baltimore schools, let me applaud that 6 years ago they dealt with the voluntary standard of 20 parts per billion. Given new concerns about the health impacts of lead in water on children in schools, the American Association of Pediatrics is now recommending a standard of 1 part per billion. And if that standard were to come into place, even our existing standards are not sufficient to meet the 1 part per billion proposed standard from the American Association of Pediatrics. So we have many factors coming into play here, including the fact that the plumbing we were putting in until 2014 had lead in it. And as we learn more about lead, the goals we have for lead in water are going down to the point that we don't currently have plumbing infrastructure that could meet the recommended 1 part per billion standard of the American Association of Pediatrics.
So given that, and understanding that we have to go through this long process of replacing the infrastructure itself, in the meantime, testing becomes ever more important and ever more vital, and the protocols that are part of the testing. Dr. Edwards, perhaps you and Ms. Bentanzo can just walk us through Flint a little bit and talk a little bit about how could it be that no violations were reported that could have helped highlight the dangers and provided decision makers with necessary information more quickly? And under the current LCR, what violations could have triggered a faster response to the water crisis there, and where did they fail, so that we can prevent another Flint from happening?
That's indeed the tragedy of Flint. If the existing law had been followed, people would have been told the lead in water was too high and they could have taken steps to protect themselves and their family. So too, the same thing in Washington, D.C. 10 years earlier. And the reason that they could say the water was safe is they were actually sampling homes that did not have lead pipe. They were not following the law. And they were using protocols that missed the lead even when it was present. So it wasn't until citizens took matters into their own hands and started sampling their water and figuring out their kids were getting lead poison that we revealed this citywide problem, and that, which now understood, they were never meeting federal law. So the cover-up, if you will, the claim that the water was safe when it was not, came about as a rise from cheating the existing standards that are out there.
So And I'd like to add to that, that the violations in the lead and copper rule are associated with treatment techniques, and they mostly come up, well, they're not associated with elevated lead. If there's a lead action level exceedance, if you get over that 15 parts per billion with your 90th percentile, there's no violation associated with that. It's just a trigger to take further action. So if a water system is triggered into a lead service line replacement, and then they fail to implement that lead service line replacement program, then they get a violation. So the violation comes way after the fact of when there's actually elevated lead. The one thing that's in the lead and copper rule that is supposed to flag corrosion issues in advance is the water quality parameters. And you had mentioned those studies and the optimal parameters that a water system is supposed to work within. So the theory is that the water quality parameters are indicators of lead release, but EPA research has shown that they are not effective indicators of lead. There's no substitute for lead sampling to know when there's elevated lead in the water. So I actually spent some time looking in the CIDWIS-Fed database that shows all the violations with the lead and copper rule before coming here. And so I saw that in Michigan, there were 10, just for 2016, there were 10 water systems with lead action level exceedances. But for the entire record of years that's available in CIDWIS-Fed, there were no water quality parameter violations.
In Michigan,
In Michigan, in CIDWIS-Fed.
in the entire state.
Right. So either they're not uploading their data, which is another issue, which is part of, not enough staff under the Public Water System Supervision Program, but it also indicates that they're not serving their purpose as an early warning of lead corrosion. So the way the lead and copper rule is currently set up, that early warning doesn't work. We need a violation associated with elevated lead levels so that there is an immediate response. Just like we have, like with our other distribution system water quality rules, the total coliform rule and the disinfection byproducts rule, they have MCL violations. If they exceed that level, they immediately have to look at corrective action at the treatment plant, and that's not the case under the lead and copper rule.
Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, and there's a complicating factor as well, because you don't, you're not out of compliance until more than 10% of the samples are above the action level. So you could have 9% of the samples above the 15 parts per billion. You've got homes with lead problems, but the whole city thinks, okay, we're in compliance, we don't have to worry. So the way it's structured is sending the wrong signals.
Thank you. And we've been joined by Senator Stabenow, who has been dealing with this issue in her home state. And I thank you so much for joining us, Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you.
They're very squirrely.
They're very squirrely, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth, very much, and I appreciate being asked to participate in this roundtable, both because of what we have been dealing with in Flint, but also with, I just came from an agriculture, nutrition, and forestry meeting where in my hat there as ranking member, also very concerned about what's happening to rural America, rural Michigan, in terms of access to water. And thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, Chair. I'd love to call you Chairman. No.
We all have been. We all have been.
I know. So, but first, I do have to say I appreciate your including Dr. Mark Edwards. Thank you for all of your efforts in Michigan. And Elon Batanzo, thank you very much for all of your efforts. We didn't want to be the poster child for this. 100,000 people in the city of Flint that have been exposed to high lead levels, and children who will deal with this the rest of their lives didn't ask for this. And so, but appreciate very much your calling out what was happening and working with Dr. Monahan and Atisha in a really pretty courageous effort to call out what was happening. And we were grateful to be able to work to get help. Took longer than it should have, but President Obama and his administration were early on helping on the health front and being able to expand Medicaid to all children up to age 21 who are exposed in the city of Flint, as well as pregnant moms, is extremely significant. As a side note, I should mention that as we read the health care bills going through, it looks like the help for Flint on health care would go away in terms of the provisions that were used by the Obama administration, which is alarming on top of everything else. But I do want to just say, and I don't know if Dr. Edwards, I apologize for being late. I don't know if you've talked about what's happening in Flint, but we are seeing steps forward, and as you know, not as fast as the families deserve or want to have happen, but because we worked very hard and had such strong support from our Democratic caucus in the Senate and in the House and President Obama, we have been able to bring in a substantial infusion of dollars to help replace the pipes and so on. So the work that was being done originally around healthcare and education and nutrition, we know that the best way to mitigate lead in children is good nutrition, and so we activated the provisions in the Farm Bill that allow us to do summer meals. Actually, a year ago, fed 38,000 children in the summer as a result of Secretary Vilsack working with us and doing the same this year. So we've been working, but bottom line is replacing the pipes. And so, you know, we've 2,000 of the 20,000 total have been replaced. The mayor's hoping by the end of this year 6,000, but it'll take till 2020 to replace all of the lead infrastructure. So, and a lot of money, and it would make a lot more sense if we were doing things right on the front end rather than what's happening. So, so I thank all of you. One other thing, just in terms of comment, and then I have a question, is when we look at the president's budget and we look at the fact that the rural water and sewer program was zeroed out in his budget, along with a whole range of other things that relate to water quality and protecting water and protecting the Great Lakes and so on, deeply concerning, particularly when we look at the fact that over half of the violations around health and water systems are in rural communities, small towns. So it's incredibly important that we be paying attention to that. But I wanted to ask a question specifically regarding the cost of water, the water bills, that because what we have seen is that a major area of concern related to people having access to clean, fresh water relates actually to water bills. Right now, the average water bill in the United States is $120 a month. It's expected. Michigan State University did a study saying it's going to rise another $50 in the next 5 years, which means that 1 out of 3 families won't be able to afford to have water in our country, which is really quite astounding. And then when you go to rural communities, it's even more when we look at what's been happening. So I'm wondering if any of you want to address the rising water rates, and particularly in the communities, urban or rural, where we've seen this in Detroit now. Major issue in terms of people not being able to pay their water bills and have access to something that we would all consider basic in terms of human rights in our country, as well as around the world in terms of access to water. So, you know, how do we address that? How do we increase technical capacity in communities? And what are your thoughts in terms of the cost of what's happening?
This is something that I've termed with the phrase water infrastructure inequality. And I think most Americans are surprised to realize that the poorest Americans pay more for their water of crappy quality than anyone else. And you ask, how is it that Flint, Michigan could have a water crisis, high lead in their water, pathogens in their shower, 12 people dying from Legionnaire's disease, and paying amongst the highest water rates not only in the United States, but in the world, for water that wasn't suitable for anything but flushing toilets?
Yeah.
And the answer starts with the fact that most of these communities get into this problem because they've lost population one way or another. They've lost jobs in the case of Flint. They've lost 60% of their population. Rural America is losing population, and you have this infrastructure that was built to support a larger population. It's like you have a house that's very, very big, and you have to maintain it, and you can't afford to do it. And so the rule we have for water quality in this country, unfortunately, is you get the water that you can afford. And so many of these communities cannot afford to meet existing federal law, much less upgrade their water systems for conservation and health needs as we know them today. And without outside money coming in, what you end up with is higher and higher water rates, crappy water, and people wanting to leave this town because they can't even provide good, safe, affordable water. And it creates what I call a death spiral, where you just exacerbate the problem to the point where you end up having a water system that's unaffordable, and as we have in Detroit and Flint right now. And the thing we have to recognize is that many cities and towns in America are following in the footsteps of Flint and Detroit. They were ahead of the curve in terms of dealing with this problem and losing civilization as we know it from this paradigm that's not working. We have to be able to get outside money to these communities to help them get safe, affordable water.
Anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question because on one hand, you're right, rates are going up and they're going to not be affordable for this human right. On the other hand, it costs money to upgrade these systems to the point where they're running efficiently. So we actually need to see greater investment in use of asset management techniques, which is basically just systematically managing your water assets, which is a movement in the industry, but we need to see more of that by all levels. And in some cases, we may need regionalization of smaller systems so that they have the staff capacity. You talked a lot about capacity to do that. The other thing that we're looking at in New Jersey is, and it's really states across the country are looking at this, is can we ensure affordability in the way that the LIHEAP program provides home heating assistance in the winter? Can we do that on the water side? So that you're not taking poor communities like Newark and asking the less poor to subsidize the more poor. You really need to broaden the base. But that will require legislative authorization. That would be a great thing if Congress could take the lead.
Thank you.
Now, our very generous ranking member, Chairman Carper.
Recovering Governor Carper. Again, thanks for, Senator Duckworth, thanks for pulling us all together and assembling to you and your staff, to John Kane and Christophe Delavar staff. Thank you for all of our staffs for the work you do. Senator Stabenow and Senator Duckworth know that we actually have, to my surprise when I got here a number of years ago, there's a prayer breakfast every Wednesday morning that probably, I don't know, 15 or 20 senators go to, and every a week that we're in session, and they either talk about somebody's, and when the senators come in, usually a current senator, sometimes a former senator, and they talk about their faith journey, and or maybe just about their lives and the influences in their life and stuff. And I usually don't get to go to that. I'm usually on a train coming down from Delaware. I go home at night, so I usually miss that. But we also have on Thursdays, in just about an hour or so, a Bible study group that meets with Barry Black, who's our chaplain, retired Navy Admiral, former Chief of Chaplains for the Navy and Marine Corps. And Cory and I go, and a couple of us, we meet in Jim Elhoff's Hideaway. And so it's Democrats and it's Republicans. We read the scripture together, we share things together, we pray together. And people will be amazed to learn that actually happens in the United States Senate, but it does. One of the things that Barry Black reminds us of, Chaplain Barry Black reminds us of, almost every Thursday when we have that Bible study, he reminds us of Matthew 25. And you may not remember Matthew 25, but it starts like that, something like this. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was thirsty, did you give me to drink? And we focus on that. He makes sure that we focus on it about every week. And I think we all have a moral obligation to make sure that people don't go hungry, have clean water to drink, don't go naked, have a decent place to live. There's a moral obligation. But since we have big budget deficits here in states and cities across the country, there's also a fiscal imperative to meet that moral obligation in a fiscally sustainable way. And I would just like you to each give us maybe one good example that you're aware of where we're able to meet that. Somebody, you know, it's a city or state or a water authority, whatever, but give us a good example of how we, through federalism, you know, federal government, state, working as partners, how we can meet that moral obligation in a more fiscally sustainable way. I like to say, find out what works, do more of that. Everything I do, I know I can do better. Give us just a way that we can meet that moral obligation in a more fiscally sustainable way. Just each of you. I don't care who goes first, but good idea from each of you, please.
So unfortunately, I can't give a good example in the United States. Unfortunately, Flint did ultimately get some money that it needs.
Who did?
But
I'm sorry.
Flint,
Yeah.
but only after a disaster. And so you have to look to other countries like Canada, like Germany, where the burden to provide water to people that's safe and affordable is shared at the state and federal level, in much the same way that we provide and share that burden for education in this country. We've decided that a basic education is a right. We make sure that some federal and state money can flow to provide that minimum level of education. We don't have a similar system at present for our water system. As I said, our current paradigm is you get the water you can afford, and if you can't afford to meet federal law, that's just your tough luck.
Let me just kind of restate my question. For the 8 years immediately before coming here and joining Senator Stabenow, we were freshmen together. But we're just kids. But before I came here, I was privileged to be governor of our state, and she was privileged to lead her state as well. But one of the things we had, I was very active in the National Governors Association. And one of the entities within the NGA is something called the Center for Best Practices. And it's a clearinghouse for good ideas. You know, if I was interested in reducing recidivism, find a state that's doing a good job, and they could help us. We're interested in reducing dropouts in schools or teenage pregnancy. Find out what's working in other places and find out that their ideas were transferable. Again, I'm looking for ways to meet this moral imperative, clean water, in a fiscally sustainable way. If you have a good idea, share it with. This is a tough issue. We have a similar kind of challenge on infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. And because the need is huge, and we talk about it all the time, the will to actually pay for it and provide the money is usually limited. Please. Elin? Has anybody ever mispronounced your name, Elin?
I answer to a lot of different names.
Okay.
So one thing that I've observed from my time working at EPA, working for water utilities, working as a consultant, is that there's kind of three different worlds. There's the people who work for water utilities, there's people who work for EPA. Most of them have never worked for a water utility. A lot of them come straight from college and go to work for the regulatory agency, and that's also true of the state agencies, but there's probably some more mixing between the people who have practical experience, working for the water utility versus the regulatory. So what I've seen then is a disconnect between the regulations and what's really needed and how everyday life is at a public water system, and what the tools that they need to be able to deal with everything they deal with on a daily basis, but particularly the water safety issues. So I think having more opportunities for collaboration, for the mixing across those different worlds, so that the people at the water utilities can have a better understanding of what the regulations are trying to achieve, but the regulators understand the day-to-day things that they're dealing with at a water utility so they can write more effective regulations. I think it would be helpful to have more back and forth between those organizations and have people move from utilities to regulatory, because they just understand what happens every day.
All right. Mary Beth? Thank you.
I can't really think of a great example of where it's currently working well. I can say, listening to the other panelists today, though, that much of the information that was shared here would have been extremely helpful for the city school system to have been aware of. So the best practices as people try and work on their own remediation efforts across the country, I think getting together groups and more information on best practices with leading experts, like some of those here, I'm not counting myself in that group, but I really think it could have helped. A lot of funds that were spent wouldn't have had to have been spent necessarily if the issues were fully understood. So I think that's something that's very important, and one other point, and it's a little bit off topic from your question.
Then hold up. I'm trying to get people to answer my question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, though. Joaquin, thank you.
Trying to think how best to directly answer your question. You know,
Not an easy question,
No, not an easy question, and I think to the
but it's
points of-
critical that we figure out how to answer it,
Yeah,
given the need.
I think we're really trying to be at the front end, or we're starting to be at the front end of what that actually means, insofar as what mechanisms do we have? And you know, I take heart. You know, when you talk about a regulatory agency in the 21st century, what does it mean, right? How do you better connect the regulations that are being crafted in a way that take into consideration what are a myriad of complexity around, especially something like drinking water quality, so as to be effective. And you know, I can't think of too many specific examples, and again, at this table, I think it's a little difficult, but I think the qualities and or the things that will ensure that sort of work are capacity building at the community level. You know, you need to have an engaged community. It doesn't help, you know, that to have the feds or the state to kind of parachute in. You need that sort of grassroots capacity building and understanding the water systems and managing them in these poor and rural communities. And that's where the real difficulty is, because you can come in and give an SRF loan to remediate, you know, do wellhead remediation for one contaminant. But if you don't have the O&M and the capacity, operation and maintenance capacity in that community to maintain that equipment, and then, you know, to Mrs. Strum's point, the sort of life cycle asset management, you know, tools that are important to then say, well, how do you maintain that? Then it's not gonna work, and it's not gonna happen. So, yeah, just continue to have those conversations, I think, at both the local, state, and federal level, so as to better align what resources and dollars are out there, and to better build capacity for understanding the problems to begin with. I think it's gonna be really important.
All right, thank you. Chris Strong?
Sure. We've seen one great example from Camden County, New Jersey, where the wastewater treatment plant has been investing, can't remember how many hundreds of millions over the last 17 years to upgrade the plant, to make it more energy efficient. They're using solar, they're extracting energy from the treatment process, and you know, other things that I don't know about, but basically they've kept rates level when you account for inflation because they've lowered costs. And it's harder to achieve those cost savings for pipe systems because they're so simple, right? They don't use as much technology, but the asset management techniques that they used for the plant apply to pipes as well, being proactive and strategic in monitoring and replacing. And so in New Jersey, we, through our Jersey Waterworks Collaborative, have supported a bill. Well, actually, New Jersey Waterworks doesn't take lobbying positions, so let me rephrase that. New Jersey Future and our colleagues, who are also members of Jersey Waterworks, have supported a bill that's on the governor's desk to require drinking water systems to do asset management. This is something the private utilities do because it's easier for them. The public utilities tend not to do. So if he signs it, all utilities will be required to do that, and then our Department of Environmental Protection will adopt rules, and we've got a cross-sector collaborative that's going to be recommending what are the aspects of those systems that need to be posted publicly so that people can know if their drinking water system is getting better or getting worse. You know, we need more accountability, and so what are the manageable metrics? So I would...
Let me stop you right there.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think one very good example. I would just say to as much to us, to my colleagues, as to you and others who might be listening to this or following this today. The question I ask is not just how do we fix our water systems. It's not just how do we fix our wastewater systems. It's not just how do we fix our roads, highways, bridges. It's all the airports, you know, air transportation. It's all those things. And there's a refusal in this country to pay for stuff that we need, and it's going to take us down. And it's going to take us down the wrong path. My staff gave me a question to ask colleagues, a question to ask to say, maybe we should go back to what we were used to do in the before 1980s when funding wastewater and clean water, drinking water systems. We'd have a block grant program through EPA, and that some of us remember that. That was great. Well, we have an administration now that wants to pretty much do away with that stuff and cripple those ideas. And USDA funding, as Senator Stabenow has said. So the idea of going back to a block grant, that ain't going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately. Last thing I would, if I could, Senator Duckworth, I had was one more quick question, and I just ask for very short answers if anybody wants to respond to this one. The many communities that are not in compliance with drinking water regs are fearful, I'm told, fearful of coming out of the shadows and facing legal action. And what can the federal government do to incentivize these communities to come forward? Just very briefly, please. Anybody? Anybody at all? Do we have any attorneys here? Oh, here's one from Baltimore.
I think some guarantee of assistance would certainly incentivize, them coming forward. I think that if there is going to be a lawsuit, if a community is going to be sued, hiding will make it worse, and they need to go ahead and come clean and be transparent. But as you said, it's very unlikely that will happen on their own. But if there's a promise of assistance and funding to actually cure the problem, then I think that they're going to hopefully look at the best interest of their constituents and take advantage of that.
All right. Anybody else with a quick thought? Thank you.
Well, I think you've put your finger on a key problem. If many of these communities were honest and came forward and said that they could not meet federal law, there would be no incentive to do so. They would be punished. And in reality, in many of these poor towns in the U.S. and post-industrial cities, we should frankly, the way things are now, be telling people that they're on their own. They're on their own to protect themselves from lead and these harmful bacteria. And we kind of have the worst of all worlds right now, where we're claiming that they're meeting federal laws and that they're being protected when they're not. And in some ways, that's worse than being in a third world country where you know that the water's not safe and you learn to adapt to protect yourself and your family.
Thank you for being so generous with your time and allowing, and again, for all of you, thank you for, you're doing the Lord's work, really important work for a lot of folks across our country. Thank you, and particularly for your states as well. Tell Christy Whitman that governor from a neighbor from a small state sends his best. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to the panelists for being here. We are at the end of our time. I very much appreciate many of you traveling further than Baltimore, but I know how tough it is to get here from Baltimore, so to be here. And again, thank you for your work in this effort, and we have a lot more to do. Thanks so much.